Oh, it's here. I close it and I open it again. Okay, you're starting. You can.
The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning and welcome to our webinar on Vantage Score 3.0. During the last 2 weeks, I'm sure that most of you have noticed that there are 2 different scores being returned on the consumer's credit report. And you may have asked yourself what the purpose was for that and what the difference is between those 2 scores. So today we would like to shed some light on the quote-unquote new score model, which is Vantage Score 3.0, and also to let you know how it will improve your qualification process. So the length of today's webinar will be about 45 minutes, and then we will open it up to questions and answers. So we plan to go about an hour today. If you have any questions during the presentation, you can enter those into the chat box, and then we'll be able to bring those up at the end of the webinar. So today we feel very fortunate to have as our presenter Veronica Herrera from Experian, the credit bureau. And Veronica is a product manager lead and bureau scores expert with Experian. She is a great resource with a wealth of knowledge, and we want to thank her for her time today and her expertise that she's here to share with us. So with that, I will pass it over to Veronica to get us started.
Thanks, Liz. Good morning, everyone. Yes, my name is Veronica Herrera, and I'm from Experian, and I am the product manager that is responsible for all the bureau scores that we build at Experian. One of the models that I'm in charge of actually is the Vantage Score credit model, so I am an expert on that, and I'll be able to hopefully answer all of your questions, and if there are other questions after the webinar, we'll be able to answer those for you as well. The presentation that I'm going to go over today is to give you a little bit of background, because there are a lot of people who are not familiar with the Vantage Score. It's been around for a while, but it's still not the primary credit model that's out in the industry. But it should be, because there are excellent characteristics to the model, and I want to make sure that you're comfortable with it, understand how the model was built, and why it's going to improve your processes. So I'm going to get started now with that, and we're going to start with, let's see here. Give me 1 second, try and move the screen. There we go. I'm going to start with a very brief history of the Vantage Score. As you all know, the FICO model is a traditional model that's been out in the industry for several decades. Started in the 1950s, became very commonly used from 1980 on, and it really was the only scoring model that was available out there, a generic model. But there are some inherent disadvantages to having a FICO model, a model that's built outside of the credit bureaus. So in 2005, the 3 credit bureaus, Experian, Equifax, and TransUnion, kind of joined forces, and we decided that it was time to create a very advanced scoring model using the best and most available data that we had at that time. But its unique characteristic was that it was going to be the same model at all 3 bureaus. I'm sure you're all aware, if you pull a credit score from Equifax, from Experian, and from TransUnion, when you're pulling a FICO, you will actually get 3 different scores for any given consumer. In fact, sometimes very different scores. And that's a disadvantage because it's difficult to establish what is the risk level of any consumer when you're getting 3 different scores. With the Vantage Score, it was the same model at each of the 3 bureaus, so that difference in scores between the bureaus is minimized. It's kept a very small percentage so that a lender or somebody who's making a credit decision can really understand what that person's credit risk is. So in 2006, the Vantage Score Model 1.0 was originally launched. It was a big deal because it was really the only challenger to the existing scoring model. It did have a different scale. Instead of the normal scale of 300 to 850 that I believe most of you are familiar with, it had a scale of 500 to 990 based on letter grades like you would receive in school. So you'd know if a person was an A grade, B grade, C grade, etc. We thought it was actually very intuitive, but unfortunately the old score range was really embedded, and it was very difficult for some people to kind of make that transition. In 2010, Vantage Score 2.0 came out, primarily because it was time to re-estimate the model. We all know that in 2008 and 2009, our country went into a very deep recession, and credit behavior changed in such a significant way that the scoring models of the past simply could not keep up. Probability of default, the likelihood that somebody was going to default on any kind of credit or financial responsibility, tripled during this time period, and the models weren't able to keep up. So Vantage Score 2.0 was re-estimated and launched in 2010. And in 2013, the Vantage Score model was completely rebuilt from the ground up. The reason we did this, and I'll step through the data elements that caused this rebuild, was because we had completely different and updated data, much more current behavior patterns, and we were able to build that score that was going to really surpass anything that we had in the past. So that's what we're going to talk about today, is the Vantage Score 3.0 model and some of its characteristics. But again, stepping back just a second, why did we create this model? What is the point of establishing a new model? It's because things have changed, in particular in the last 10 years. So after a significant change in the way people would lend or have that availability of credit available to consumers, finally people are starting to open up again and start lending and start in the case of tenant screening, to be able to allow more people to come in. But we have to do it in a more controlled manner. Consumers are much more aware of their credit score, of their credit history, and of what's going on credit-wise. So you needed a model that was very transparent. You probably know that some of these older models like FICO, you really don't know how they work. You have no idea. You know you get a score, but you really have a hard time understanding how can you affect that score. Vantage Score is completely different from that. The operational dependencies of always counting on one particular score, any one given score, became a threat. And, of course, increased regulations in the last 10 years. The CFPB, the OCC, all these government bodies were really starting to crack down on the scoring models because of their, what we call exclusive nature, of the lack of ability to score people, left certain groups out in the margins. And again, that's another characteristic the Vantage Score has been able to address. So the Vantage Score model, at its essence, is a very superior credit risk model. It's a generic model that can be used by any kind of lender or any company who's making credit decisions. It is consistent across the three bureaus. It is a very high-performing model. In other words, it separates goods and bads very, very well. But again, one of its most important characteristics is its inclusiveness, its ability to score almost everyone. So what I want to do is I want to go through these value propositions. What is it about the model that makes it unique, that's going to help people who are making credit decisions and give them that level of comfort to be able to use this model. So as we said, there is a significantly higher predictive power, its ability to determine whether a person's true risk is finely high-tuned. It is more stable, and I'll explain exactly why this model is more stable, and you will be able to use it for a longer period of time than traditional models. The fact that it scores literally almost 40 million, we've analyzed this, and we found that it scores almost 40 million consumers more than traditional models. And the fact that it was completely reorganized to become far more consumer-friendly, not just in the score range, but in its the consumer's ability to understand what's in their score and how they can affect that change. But more than just making these statements, I want to show you how it does this, why it does this. So let's talk a little bit about that increased accuracy. Why can this model score more accurately than other models? What makes it different? In the last couple of years, the three bureaus have redone their databases. They essentially created far more definitive characteristics within the credit database. Just to give you an example of what this means is, in the past, most bureaus could not distinguish between different mortgage loans. So if you had a mortgage, it was just simply called a mortgage loan. So it didn't matter if it was a first mortgage, a second mortgage, a HELOC or HELoan. But what we found is that there are significantly different default rates associated to those types of loans. And it was crucial to create these attributes that we had the ability to distinguish them. In the past, all student loans have simply been classified as installment loans. So whether or not you had a furniture loan or a student loan, they were looked at the same. But as we know, student loans have deferment periods. They are grouped in certain different ways, and it was important to distinguish them. In the past, you could not distinguish between secured revolving trades and unsecured revolving trades, when clearly there's a huge difference in the risk level of each of those types of trades. So having this ability to create these finite data elements was imperative in creating attributes that feed the model that are far superior to anything we have, and gave us that ability to create a more predictive model. And also helped align the score, again, across the three bureaus, so that when you pull a three-bureau score, you get something that numbers that are extremely aligned. When I talk about what it means for the model to be stable, anytime you build a credit model, a credit score, the model is fine-tuned to a particular time frame, the time frame after which the model was created. So you take a large data sample. Now normally a data sample will have about 1 million to 2 million consumers. Vantage Score, because it's tied to the three bureaus, is the only credit score that it was modeled after 45 million consumers, by far the largest data sample ever used in the creation of a generic model. And we did something different. We didn't use 1 2-year period for this data sampling. We used 2 separate 2-year periods. And the reason we did this was because we wanted to include the higher risk behavior that we saw during the recession, right, 2009 to 2011 timeframe. But we also wanted to include the recovery transition period. Because if you only calibrate the model to high risk behavior, when things get better, the model stops working. So we wanted a model that could work both in risky times and in more stable times. And that's what's going to extend the life of the model, and you'll be able to use it for longer periods of time. So that is what I mean by stability of the model. But let's get to what everybody really wants to know. Why can Vantage Score score almost 40 million people more than traditional models? The older models have been around for a very long time. They're really staples in the industry. How is it that 15% of the population is consistently not scored by traditional models? And that is a published number. FICO actually published this in their white paper. They score about 85% of the scoreable population, and they understand that. But Vantage Score, for 2 reasons. One, that new granular data that I talked about before, that really specific data, allows the model to use far more information to generate. So let me talk a little bit about why the old models can't score. If you don't have very granular data, you need a lot of it to compensate for not having the granular data. So you need to have very recent and a long history. So FICO models, their exclusion criteria is you have to have a trade that is older than 6 months and has had a recent update within the last 6 months. So who does this exclude? It includes people with thin files, with new files, and what we call stale files. People who do not use credit very, very often will sometimes fall out of scoring. So for example, let's say you have some credit cards, but you, for whatever reason, didn't need to use them anymore. You don't use them for 6 months, you will not get a score from FICO anymore. It doesn't mean you're not a great credit risk, it just means you're not, always using credit. So that new population, we're asked all the time, so who are these people? Are they extremely high risk? Are they very subprime people? Who are they? What we find is this new consumer are people who do not use credit very often. So you'll see a lot of older Americans will, they're just not used to using their cards, or maybe they've already paid off their auto loans or mortgages or whatever, but they're still great credit risks. New entrants, students getting it right out of college, people just coming into the country, people who don't update things very often. But this new population, this 35 million consumer new population, there is a mix. So about 2/3 of them are higher risk, right? Because if you really do have a very new file, if you've only had a credit card for 6 months, you are high risk. I mean, that's part of your profile. But what we found is about 1/3 of them were actually very low risk, what we would consider very, very lendable, or people with excellent credit. So it was very interesting to see what is the population that we are talking about that comes in new. But obviously, for any kind of lender or credit decision maker, this means a much larger population that you can look at. And it is important because even if you get the score and they don't meet your criteria, it's important to know that, as opposed to not getting anything and having to make blanket decisions on groups simply because you don't get a score. So now we're going to move on to what changes did we make to Vantage Score 3.0 to make it more both lender-friendly and consumer-friendly. So again, I was telling you that the older Vantage Score models had a score range of 500 to 990 with letter grades. Over the years, what we found was, from feedback from both consumers and from people who make credit decisions, was that they were so used to the FICO range of 300 to 850 that shifting that gear was a little difficult. So instead of fighting it, we just decided, let's just make it, follow that traditional scale, right? And we give you here some credit tiers. These are not meant to determine what your credit limit criteria is. This is just to give you a general guide of what is generally thought of as a subprime consumer versus a prime consumer or a super prime consumer. Obviously, cutoffs are completely based on whoever's making that credit decision. But overall, it's easier to understand, well, what does a 600 mean? What does a 700 mean, etc., because people were already used to it. And that's sort of on the lender side and understanding the score. But there's other information that you'd want to know about Advantage of any credit score, actually, that's more than just understanding the score and understanding where you fall in the distribution of scores. And that's to understand what affects your score specifically, right? Why did I get a 650 or a 700 or whatever the score was? Those come from reason codes, from the score factor codes that are delivered with the credit score. Traditionally, those scores have been a little bit vague and a little cryptic. So they might say something like, the reason you got this was the number of credit cards or revolving traits you have on your credit report. Okay, well, do I have too many or do I have too few? Is that a good thing? Is it a bad thing? What should I do about having that? The Vantage Score credit score factor codes say things specifically like your balance to limit ratio is too high. Try to keep it below 30% to get the best score. And so it not only tells you what's happening, but it tells you what to do about it. And Vantage Score has created a website called reasonco.org, where if you type in the score factor code, it'll actually give you not only the description of the code, but it'll tell you specifically what is causing your score to go up or down and what you need to do about it. Right, in very clear language, not this vague stuff of, it might be this, it might be that. And we've also had the entire website and all the codes completely translated into Spanish. We have a huge Spanish population in this country, and I'm not sure why, but for many years, all the codes have always been delivered in English, and leaving out a significant portion of the population to really not understand what was going on. They just got their score and they said, okay, well, that's what we're going to have to deal with. But now they actually get education and a very deep understanding of what's going on with their credit score and what they can do about it in a language that they can understand. The Vantage Score has also, the Vantage Score Solutions LLC, the company that actually owns the proprietary model, has also created several additional educational websites. So there is yourvantagescore.com, as well as a creditscorequiz.com. And these are additional sites beyond reasonco.org that give consumers a very deep understanding of what a Vantage Score is, how their Vantage Score was created, and what they can do about it. Because the reality is that a consumer who understands their score will become more protective of it. They will want to keep their score high or to improve their score. And what that means is that they will become much more cognizant of making sure that all of their bills and all of their debt is paid on time. They're much less likely to let things go late if they know, oh, if I do that, it's going to drop my score, and I've been working hard to increase my score. So it really is, consumer education is very, very important. And we have taken a completely different approach than FICO. We don't want to keep our score black box. We want people to understand how it works so that they can improve it. One of the things that we get asked a lot by people who use our models, not just consumers, but actually people who are making the credit decision, is what is the weight? What influence, what's important in generating a score? You might have seen this before in other scores as a pie chart. We'll say, well, credit history is 30%, or inquiries are 2%, or whatever that ratio is. But the problem with that, of course, is that it's not a mathematical formula in that sense. You cannot say exactly 30% of your score is your credit history. So what we're trying to show here is that it's relative. In this model, payment history is by far the most influential. So people who pay their bills on time will have the most positive effect on a credit score, as opposed to having an inquiry or what their available credit is, which has a very small influence. And of course, things like the credit limit ratio that you have, the utilization that you have, or overall debt that you might have more kind of moderate impact on your score. This is important because this is something that changes over time. It changes significantly. I'm going to give you an example of that. So we ran an analysis to see what truly affected a score at different time periods. So we have a time period before the recession, during the recession, and now after the recession. Because in the last 10 years, we have seen significant changes in consumer behavior. Here's what you're going to notice, that things like payment history is always going to be very important. But look at recent credit. What happened in the recession that made recent credit, opening up new cards or making inquiries towards new cards, so important? In 2010, if you were opening or trying to get new credit, it was a strong signal that you were in trouble, that you were in financial trouble. You needed to have that credit available to you. And people were looking for credit very openly. But generally speaking, they were related to higher risk consumers. So having a lot of inquiries and a lot of open trades kind of was a signal that you were in some, maybe not serious financial trouble, but at least heading in that direction. Nowadays, that's changed. If you open up a credit card, it doesn't mean you're in financial trouble. It means you needed or wanted a new credit card or a new loan. So the influence of having inquiries and new credit went from 30% in a time, a very risky time, to 5% because things are starting to normalize now. And you can see that what's really important, what's really predictive of a person defaulting on a loan is how they pay their bills. Are they on time? And so that went from 28% importance to a 40% importance. And so this slide here is really meant to show that it's important to have a model that is calibrated on current behavior. The most commonly used model by any lender is actually a model that was built in 1998, calibrated on behavior from 1995 to 1997. And obviously we know that that has changed significantly. The world has changed and consumer behavior has changed. So those models just cannot capture the information the way they need to based on the new credit behaviors that people have nowadays. And it is important to always keep up with the latest and greatest scoring out there. Now, I'm going to spend a little more time on this slide because even if you're completely convinced, okay, Vantage Score is the greatest score ever, we love it, now what? What do I do about it now? How do I understand it so that I can start using it and taking advantage of all those great things that the Vantage Score can do for me? So the first thing, of course, was our changing the Vantage Score to a more familiar score range, right? At that scale that people could really be comfortable with and say, okay, I get what this means. But the other thing is that we looked at the two models, and they are built completely different, okay? The old models and the new models are not, we're not saying that you're going to score the same. You're not going to. Vantage Score 3.0 is looking at different things in your credit report. I'll give you an example. You might notice that if a consumer has a delinquency, maybe 4 years ago, some kind of ding or some negative aspect on their credit report, you'll see that it really still affects their older scores. You pull a FICO, you say, hey, that person's score is still kind of low. But this happened 4 years ago, and a lot of people in 2009, 2010, they got behind on their bills. But as soon as things changed, they started repairing, they started keeping up with those bills. What Vantage Score does is it focuses on the most recent behavior. So you'll see a lot of the attributes are focused more on what's happened in the last 6 months, 12 months, 18 months, because that is far more indicative of a person's risk level than what happened 4 years ago, right? Especially if they've been really cleaning that up. So a person with an old derogatory will actually have a better Vantage Score than they might have in a traditional model. But there's another kind of flip side to that, and you might have seen this. There is a characteristic within the FICO model that allows a person with a very thin file or a very young file to score very high. So I'll give you an example of one of my daughter's friends. She's 20 years old, and she's had a credit card for about a year. And she has never gone late on that card. She does pay her bills on time. And she has a very high FICO score. It was like almost 800. And while I think she's a terrific girl, she's still a risk. She's still a high risk because she only has one card. And for a very short period of time, there's an inherent risk in this person. Now, granted, as her credit report gets thicker and older and she starts showing more stable behavior, of course her score is going to improve and go higher, and it should. But at the beginning, when there's still that uncertainty, that score should reflect that higher risk. So in many cases, you're going to see a person who scores very well on the older models. You look at Vantage Score and say, wow, this score really dropped, maybe even 100 points. But it's because the model is now looking at this person as a risk, a higher risk consumer than older models do. So those are kind of some opposite ends of why a person could go from a very low old score to a very high new score, or vice versa. But when we take large sample distributions, and we've done this for several of our larger clients and lenders, what we found is that when we take a look at large populations of millions of consumers or more, we see that approximately the same populations fall in each of the risk categories. So when we look, about the same group of people score above a 500, score above a 600, 700, etc., so that the classifications are still the same relative number of super prime consumers, or subprime consumers. That doesn't change. So the populations distribute about the same. But the probability of default is not the same. All right? And this is where we're going to be able to use this new model to our advantage. So as you can see here, and this little table that's on this slide is meant to be an example. I'm not saying that this is any one particular score or another. This is to give you an idea of how this works. So if you took your old score, whatever model you were using in the past, and you see what their probability of default is for their scoring groups, and you just need to look at the odds charts or the performance charts for that model. They're published by every company who puts out a model. You would see, well, if I have my cutoff at, a 700 or a 720 or whatever that cutoff is, and maybe you have tiers, you will have a probability of default associated to that score, right? In this example, a 720 roughly has a probability of default of about 2.7%. So overall, just under 3% of the population will meet the definition of bad, which in most cases is somebody who goes 90 days or more past due on an account. If you want to keep the same risk level, if you say, well, I want to know what my new score cutoff is going to be in this new model, you would line up that probability of default using the performance charts for the new model. And in this particular case, you would see that same 2.7 probability of default on the new model is associated now closer to about a score of 700. So that 720 translates to a 700. Now, just by coincidence, what we have noticed as we've been doing these validations for our clients for a long period of time is that that's exactly what happens with the Vantage Score. Roughly, a person's score is going to be about 20 points lower. It doesn't mean that that person is riskier. It means that the risk level at that 20% or 20-point lower score is actually a better risk. Now, what does that mean for a lender? Right? If I knew that this one person was a 700, but now they're getting a 680, it doesn't mean they're riskier. It means that that 680 is a better score, and it's actually a higher score than that 700. And I can feel safe and confident in bringing that person on, knowing that their risk level is better. So when you do that, when you actually are allowed to lower your cutoffs, but not bring on more risk, that's where the person who's making that credit decision gets the advantage. They can now open up their criteria and approve more people without taking on more risk, right? So a larger population is going to come in. So that's in addition to the new population that's now scoreable. Remember, we had a group of people that could not get scores before, and now they can. But now we're talking about people who perhaps couldn't be scored before, but because of the way or the model they were being scored at wasn't showing you their true risk, and they fell below your risk threshold. But looking at them with new eyes, with the Vantage Score model, you will see that these people actually are a good risk and they actually meet your criteria. When we do analysis, what are known as swap-in, swap-out sets. When you switch from one model to another, you look and see, well, which group will always be approved and which group will always be declined, but what's that new group that I can bring in? And is it larger than the new group that's going out? And what we find is almost always the swap-in set using Vantage Score is larger than the swap-out set. So by understanding the new score and using the new score, you will actually be able to approve more people and still keep your bad rates very, very low. Okay. There are some, like I said, there are some consumers, individual consumers, that will see large variances in their score, but those are those unique characteristics. Those people who had very, very old, let's say, collection scores will see a strong improvement, and people with very thin files or very young files could see a significant drop. But again, to the person who's making the credit decision, this is important to know because you get a much better risk assessment. Okay. Now, for those of you that are asking, well, where can I get this information? How can I get what the probability of default is of my old score versus my new score, and what the population distributions are. So we have performance charts for Vantage Score. There's another distinct advantage to the Vantage Score is that here at Experian, we validate the Vantage Score model every year, and we will publish brand new performance charts every year. FICO does not do that. They only have their old charts, but we can get fairly close in trying to understand what your threshold is, how risky a person you want to bring on or not. We can look at that and always have an equivalent to the Vantage Score. And year after year, everyone who's making these credit decisions should gauge this to say, do I need to change that cutoff? Is my 600 still a good score cutoff or not? Do I need to modify that? So we do have this information. We'd be very happy to share that, and you will have help in understanding what that new score cutoff is. So that's the end of my presentation, but I would definitely love to see if there are any questions or anyone who needs additional help with this.
It seems, thank you, Veronica. That was a very clear and thorough presentation. I think that our clients feel the same way because there are no questions that have popped up. I'm sure that the questions will come up after, and as you're paying more attention to the report and the different scores. So we do want to welcome those questions when they do come about. Oh, actually, you know what? There is a question here, so I will get to that. But as I was saying, when the questions do pop up and you notice, for a period of time you will be receiving both scores, that's FICO and Vantage Score. And any questions that do pop up, we want to welcome them and encourage you to call our customer support line at 888-534-1233. That number is available on our website and within your account settings. We also can accept email questions. We have info@checkpointscreening.com, and we'd be happy to get those answers over to you. So I'm going to start with the first question that popped up on our list. Just a moment. Okay, it says, question is, can't see who the question is from, but it says, good morning. Will using Vantage Score increase our cost? And luckily, we also have in attendance someone that may be able to answer that question in terms of how it's going to impact your current report cost, which is a very important question.
It's definitely a great question. Good morning. This is Olga. And this is something that if you are interested in receiving the Vantage Score as your primary score, then definitely call our office, and we would love to review your package and see what would be the best fit for you.
Okay.
And I think we have the information at the end, right? The office number, the phone number, and the email.
Correct. It says, how about bankruptcies? How recent and how far back does a bankruptcy affect the score? So I'm going to let Veronica answer this question.
Sure. That's an excellent question. Bankruptcies, as you know, are probably the single most negative factor in anybody's credit report. And it is a thing that affects most scores the most severely. There is a difference in the way Vantage Score does look at bankruptcies, because it's not just a matter of having that bankruptcy and exactly how long it's on there. A bankruptcy will be on your credit report for 7 to 10 years, depending on which bankruptcy it is, right? And as long as it is on your credit report, it will, to a certain extent, affect your score. It'll most likely, if it's older and you have a lot of good things that are balancing it out, you're going to see that the recovery period on a bankruptcy score, or excuse me, on a bankruptcy on your credit report is going to have, it's going to fix itself faster with Vantage Score, given a person's change in behavior and improvement of scores. Okay, so that is generally speaking, how it would affect it. There's an infographic that I can actually give you that you might be able to post on your website. It talks about these relative actions, bankruptcies, late payments, inquiries, and it tells you more or less how the curve, right, how they affect your score very much at the beginning, but how their influence starts decreasing and at what point, right? What things start falling off and really not having that much of importance after 3 months, 6 months, 5 years, or all the way to 10 years. And I think that will give a better gauge to understand how strongly a bankruptcy will affect your score.
So we can certainly put that that infographic. We'd love to get that
Absolutely.
and place it on our website. Just providing more resources and more information for you, because it is a new model and we understand that it will take some getting used to, and those questions will pop up. So we'd love to have that added. The other question, or second part of that question, was how does a past unpaid medical bill affect score? We have a number of potential tenants who have a good history of paying on time but have an older unpaid medical bill because it is so high. That is the end of it.
Yeah, no, I completely understand. And by the way, this medical collections topic is very hot right now. You probably imagine it's all over the newspaper, and especially since FICO just recently came out with a new press release regarding their new models. Now, I'm going to tell you that what you're seeing in the news right now about FICO and the medical collections does not apply to the FICO that you're using, and it will not, because FICO is not going to change any of their models. It will apply to a new model that will be coming out next year, where they are decreasing the impact of medical collections. Now, I can tell you right now, paid medical collections do not affect Vantage Score at all. Vantage Score has found that paid collections are not predictive, and they remove them completely from the model, which is excellent news for people who have gone through either medical collections or non-medical collections and gotten rid of them. It will not affect their score. It does affect older models, by the way, because any collection that there's history on your credit report, it will affect it. Now, two and a half years later, now FICO is starting to get on board and realize, oh, yeah, we need to remove those paid medical collections or any kind of collections. And they're stating that their medical collections have a lesser impact. Well, of course they have a lesser impact, because medical collections today are not the same as collections that you might have seen on a credit report in 1995. Remember, when the model was built, the older models were built, having the collections was a strong indicator that you were in serious trouble. Now it means your insurance was billed the wrong way, you're in dispute with the insurance company, whatever, there could be all sorts of reasons. The Vantage Score has the ability to distinguish between what we call high balance collections and low balance collections. And generally speaking, medical bills tend to be actually low balance collections. They're $75, $50, $30. It's crazy. And those have been pulled out, and you can make a distinction in certain group levels, right? You can't make that a sweeping statement across the board because it affects different people differently. But there is just inherent changes in the way the models look at collection accounts nowadays because they are different. And that's something that Vantage Score has always done. So, but now, you're asking if it still affects the score? Yes, it does. So if you want to go in addition, you would have to see, okay, besides the score, let's look at those medical collections and say, oh, really, the majority of the collections are medical, so we're going to disregard those. And then that way you can make the right decision.
So you're still encouraged to look at the individual trade lines that are being reported,
right.
But Vantage does take into consideration that it's been paid and that the type of collection account is also factored in?
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
More so the balance.
Okay.
The balance, yes.
Perfect. So the next question is, do you have a new score value?
Do I have a new score value?
Maybe we could expand on that because it's a little bit vague.
An individual person will have a different score value, if that's the question. Remember, every model looks at different aspects of your credit report and weighs things differently, right? So it looks at your report and says, how long have you had this report? How many kind of cards do you have? What type of trades? When was the last time you had a delinquency? And it will all weigh it differently. Are we getting more...
All right. So moving on to our next question, it says, does the new model require that we update our application criterion to include the credit risk factor?
credit risk factors. If you're talking about the score factor codes, no, that's just delivered with the score. You don't have to use it if you don't want to. Now, it is a requirement if you do have to do adverse action on a consumer. You not only have to give them their score, you have to give them their score factors. So if that's the case, then yes, you'll have to bring in those score factor codes. But again, that's to your advantage to have the score factor codes. As far as do you need to change your criteria, the reality is you don't have to. Again, the score distributions for the populations that distribute are approximately the same, but you're not taking advantage of all the full benefits of the model if you're not. So we would highly recommend that you look at your score cutoffs, wherever those tiers are, and say, what are they going to be in Vantage Score? And what you're going to find is you're going to be able to approve more people. So you could keep it at the slower one, but you're not really going to take advantage of everything. What you are going to have is a higher quality person. So the person that you are now approving is actually going to be significantly lower risk than what you were used to. And that's fine, right? So your portfolio is going to look fine, and your credit, your client is going to look great. But again, you're not going to be able to take advantage of all that you could get. So we do encourage you to look at the performance charts and set those cutoffs again. And by the way, you should do that every year. People don't realize it. Now granted, there's not major changes that happen every year, but sometimes, like what we saw in 2008 and 2009, sometimes one year can make a huge difference, right? And now the economy is starting to stabilize, so you may not have to change. If you said, oh, my cutoff is 620, all right, and maybe next year it'll be 620, maybe it'll be 625, whatever that is. But if we go into another recession and we see another hit to our economy, you might have to make that 670 just to keep at the same risk level that you were used to before. So it is important to gauge that.
That is a very, very good point. Also, some of our clients like to take into consideration their vacancy rates and
Of course.
just other factors that go into that. So keep in mind that you can change your criteria, and the way that you can do that is by contacting Checkpoint. You can contact your account representative, you can contact customer support, and we'd be happy to let you know how to go about changing the criteria that's set up on your whatever recommendation tool it is that you're using right now. And another question that we have, last but not least, is the webinar going to be recorded and available for viewing after? Most definitely. We see a great value in this webinar and feel very lucky, like I said before, that Veronica was able to be a part of this. So we are recording it, and we will be placing the webinar on our website. You can find it under Resources, a Vantage Score webinar.
There's one other last point that I would like to make. As you see the side-by-side comparisons of the old score with the new score, I want to kind of let you know what sort of things you might expect. So the first thing you're going to notice is that a great portion of the people that come back with what's known as an exclusion score, right? The no score code that says you do not get a FICO score on this consumer, the Vantage score will have an actual valid score. So that's the first change that you're going to see. The second thing is, again, you're very likely, especially in that 600 to 700 range, what you're going to see is that Vantage score is going to come in, there will be some exceptions, but overall, somewhere in about 15 to 20 points lower. It does not mean that the person is riskier. It actually means that that person is less risky. There's just less risk associated to that score. So be cognizant of that, and once you start seeing, oh, a good consumer or a good renter applicant has this score, as you get used to the score, you will realize I can confidently lower that score range and not be panicked that, oh, I'm taking on a significant risk here. So those are a couple of things that and by the way, in the higher scores, the variance is very tiny. As you get lower, that variance starts to get a little larger.
I actually have a question for you, Veronica.
Yes.
You mentioned different FICO score models. So can you comment on that a little bit more? I personally come from a banking and mortgage industry originally, and we are used to, in that industry, to one model. And when you hear FICO score, you only think that that's one score for all. And I think that you could actually educate us on that topic.
Yes, that's a very good point. This is the wonders of marketing. FICO has done a very good job of convincing the world that they are one model, and they are not. Absolutely not. I can tell you at Experian we have 49 FICO models of different kinds, right? We have risk models, insurance models, bankruptcy models. We have auto models, mortgage models, bank card models, new acquisition models, FICO 2, FICO 3, 4, advanced, next gen. All of those are individual. That's just at Experian. And TransUnion has its own set, and Equifax has its own set. So if you think about it, there are probably hundreds of FICO models out there. Just so that you know the one that you get at FICO, myfico.com, that's not used by any lender. That is a consumer-facing one. So when people say, wait a minute, I got my FICO from here, or I got my credit score over there, and you're telling me this, it depends completely on what model you're using. And most lenders have no idea which one they're using, by the way. And I can tell you that the one that's being used the most, Classic version 2 from 1998.
Wow. That explains it. That explains it why a lot of times there is that difference when you look at different bureaus and same score. You're thinking that you're looking at the same model, but the score comes back different, and this is why. And also sometimes consumers complain that my score is this, however, what you are pulling is not matching. So this explains why, because everywhere, each industry or each niche has its own model. Where if you look at the Vantage score, it's actually pretty similar across the board.
It's exactly the same.
Oh, it is exactly the same.
Exactly the same at all three bureaus, and the consumer score, the one that they can actually, you can go to My Vantage Score, you can actually buy your own Vantage score, just like you could in any other score. It will be the exact same one that the lender is using.
Well, that's
So we have one model, period. Now we do have the 3 different versions. There are some lenders who have not wanted to move up to the last version, and that's something that happens. Unfortunately, lenders do not want to necessarily move up to the most recent. So some people could get a Vantage score that's on the older scale, and that will be different. But if you're pulling a Vantage Score 3.0, it doesn't matter which bureau, where you're pulling it, whether you're getting it yourself or you're getting it from your lender. It will be the exact same model.
across the board.
Across the board.
That's great.
Truly in one model.
Yeah.
We are running right on time, so it looks like more questions are popping up, and we'll go ahead and try to get to those as well. Somebody is asking how, or if using Vantage Score will affect the red flags portion of the report. And I believe what they're referring to, I should be able to answer this question, is the address discrepancy alert that pops up on the credit report, or Social Security fraud detect. And no, it will not affect that. That is a separate component of the credit report. Vantage Score will only affect the scoring model. Yeah, the risk. Another question that came up is, how does Vantage Score treat a 4-year charge-off when the creditor reports that charge-off every month?
So the dates that are associated are irrelevant. So you cannot make an old account look new just because you're reporting it, right? That information is still on your credit report. But the date, when a particular charge-off, well, the first delinquency date is very key in any derogatory information. As you know, information has to drop off after 7 years. People are always concerned, well, if it drops off after 7 years, but then the new collection starts, can't they just extend that forever? No. Information drops from the date of the first delinquency. The first derogatory that led to that charge-off is the date on which that will stop affecting it. Now, if there is a charge-off and it's 4 years, it will not fall off the credit report, obviously, so it will still affect it. But how things affect Vantage Score versus other models is that most delinquent information will start to repair itself quicker than older models, as long as the behavior has changed, right? So as long as there aren't any new charge-offs or new delinquencies or new things that are coming up that are more recent, then yes, that score will actually start repairing itself much quicker.
That answered the question.
I hope so.
If you have more,
I believe this is going to wrap up our webinar for today. We had some great questions and very clear answers from Veronica. I personally feel a lot more aware and informed of my own credit score and how to manage that and control it. So I'm hoping that this has shed a lot of light on this new model and provided you with some useful information. As we mentioned before, we do welcome the questions that are going to pop up as you start paying more attention to the different models. And as mentioned, you are receiving 2 score models right now and will be receiving this for about another 30 days is the trial period that we are offering right now. So after 30 days, you will be forced to make a decision to either go with one model or another or both. And at that point, Checkpoint will accommodate you based on whichever model that you prefer. But in the meantime, the questions that come up in regards to the score, in regards to your criteria, please direct them to our customer support line at 888-534-1233. That is our main line, and also available, or questions can be directed to email at info@checkpointscreening.com. And we look forward to the questions and are excited about this new model. So thank you, Veronica.
Thank you.